Okay, we're going to try this, give us a go. Finally, everybody can see everything. This is just a blank paper. And I'm going to create a puddle because it's going to be helpful for explaining what I'm trying to explain. And it's just going to be a little rectangular puddle. Here's my water, 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 water. And I was going to talk about the stages of wet. I guess it's stages of wet paper, because water is always the same wetness, but the paper is not always the same wetness. And so I put in my puddle, and let's go grab some green, and I'm putting some green in there. Here's an interesting thing. Notice what happens when I put paint into this particular puddle. Notice it hits and it spreads like crazy. I hit another one over there. That's sloppy wet, okay? And sloppy wet, when you put stuff in with sloppy wet, the paint just goes everywhere. It travels, particularly when you drop it in. When I'm dropping in color like that, taking and just touching the tip of it in there, it spreads everywhere. Okay, and that's sloppy wet, and that's a cool thing. I can I lift up the paper, I roll it around like that. Notice I can have the paint travel with the water all over the paper. And if I'm trying to make a flat wash, this is an easy way to do it with the sloppy wet in the puddle going everywhere. Notice it makes a nice even distribution of the paint. I got to be careful that I don't run outside my puddle, but I've made that sloppy wet. It's also pretty shiny, right? When we see it, we see the shiny, shiny, shiny sheen. And here's the thing. Notice that the shine goes pretty much over the whole thing. You can see it everywhere on that. So that's sloppy wet. And that's one stage of watercolor paints. Okay, I'm taking my brush and I'm just gonna dab it on my paper towel here, and I'm going to pull out some of this extra water that I had because I wanted to go to the next stage of watercolor paper on having some water. So I'm pulling out extra water because I didn't want it to be sloppy wet anymore. And you can let this dry and that sort of a thing. It's kind of destroyed my sheen on that one, my even wash. But here's interesting. Do you notice how it looks different on the reflection? I can start to see some of the texture of the paper on that. It's not sloppy wet anymore. There are some areas, like right in here, that's pretty wet, but the sheen, the shine is different on that. Now let's take that same drop-in thing and see what happens. Okay, so I'm going to take my green into green, and I'm just going to touch it right here. Notice it still spreads, but it doesn't go over the whole entire paper. And so I'm going to drop in another little part here. So I can control kind of where the green paint is going to go. I know that it's going to go here and it's going to spread, but it's going to stop. It's not going to go all the way to the edge. This is still a little bit wetter than what I would probably like, but the green stays fairly close. The paint stays fairly close. So this is kind of wet. Okay, so there's sloppy wet, and this is kind of wet that we're looking for on that. And so you can put in colors on top of each other, and they'll have a blended edge around the paint when we put them in there, and it won't spread too far, which means you can create a gradient sort of effect by the changing of the consistency of the water on the paper. Okay, and so that's kind of a cool deal. I'm going to rinse off my brush here a little bit. I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to pull out a little bit more water. Unfortunately, I'm getting a little bit of the pigment out of it too. Normally what I would do is I just let it dry. But because I want to show you guys kind of some different types of things that happen with it, I wanted to pull out some of that extra water. Okay, so now let's look at the shine. Notice the shine is dull. It's no longer very, very shiny at all. Even when it was on the stage of being kind of wet, it was still had a shine to it, but this is almost gone. you can just see that there's just a hint of shine there. Now let's see what happens when we take our paint and we put it in there. Now when I drop the paint into this area, it stays even closer. It still spreads, but it doesn't spread very far at all. And it also doesn't dissolve out quite as much. You notice how it's staying close at home. When this stuff, notice how this one up here, we can definitely see where when it was kind of wet on that, it hit and it ran a little bit. Maybe a good 1/4 of an inch to a 1/2 an inch from side to side. This one, when I place it in there, you'll notice it stays pretty much at home. But it still creates a fuzzy edge, a gradient type of an edge, a fuzzy edge that we're working on. And this is what I call kind of dry. I think I just invented that term, kind of dry. It's still wet, but it's kind of dry on that, and so it doesn't spread very far. So sloppy wet, it spread everywhere. Kind of wet, it hit and it spread, but it didn't go all the way to the edge. It stayed relatively close. And then kind of dry, it's staying mostly right exactly where it is on those. And so those are different stages of wetness for your paper that you can use when you're adding in your various values, going from light to dark, and colors that you want to go in one space, but you don't want it to spread too far in the other space as you put those together. And so that's another tool you can learn to develop when you're creating your watercolor paintings. Now, how do you get to those phases? One, I pulled some of the water out, right? That's one way to do it. But you can also do it by letting it dry gradually, or by adding more water in. It gets more sloppy, right, as you do it. But you lose things if I put sloppy wet back into it, okay? And so those are the stages of watercolor paint. I guess the last one is, I'm waiting to hear, when the paper is dry, it behaves completely different. Let's see if I can do this one in the middle. I don't know if it's dry yet. It might be dry enough. And now when I come and I put this, touch that there, you'll notice that it does not blend. It has a hard line on it. And if I'm dropping in color, you know, if I'm just touching it, it's going to stay exactly where it is. It's not going to spread. You're going to have a hard line around it. This is called dry. And you can have dry paper. You can have a dry paper with pigment in it, and you notice the difference on how they spread. One of them spread a ton, right? We had sloppy wet, spread all over the whole thing. Kind of wet, it stayed pretty close. Kind of dry, it stayed really close. And then dry, it stays exactly where you put it. It does not run, it does not bleed, it stays right where it is. And so those are kind of the 4 stages of watercolor paint when you're trying to work with it. And each of them has a different sort of a look for it. And hopefully you'll be able to learn to utilize those a little bit more and more in your painting. And I'll kind of draw those out and show you those things when we continue on with our avocado.